you say that the Huberman Lab podcast, quote, lacks enough scientific rigor and critical thinking?
He has no excuses because he's an amazing scientist.
And you said that Dr. Anna Lembke's Dopamine Nation was, quote, total pseudoscience. Why do you say that?
Well, let me start with Dopamine Nation. I couldn't put him down because it's such a train wreck of a book. I was totally amazed that a professor will write things with such a lack of scientific support.
Dr. Hermes Solenzol is a retired neuroscientist and expert in pain physiology, as well as a former member of UCLA's Brain Research Institute.
Dr. Hermes Solenzol, welcome to my podcast, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
So on the subject of dopamine, you said that the Huberman Lab podcast, quote, lacks enough scientific rigor and critical thinking on the subject of dopamine. And you said that Dr. Anna Lembke's Dopamine Nation was, quote, total pseudoscience. Why do you say that?
Well, let me start with Dopamine Nation. I read it, I think it was last summer when I was camping in the mountains. And the truth is I couldn't put it down. I couldn't put it down because it's such a train wreck of a book. I was totally amazed that a professor will write things with such a lack of scientific support. And so the book reads also very well because it's a lot about her treating her patients. But I was stunned by the things like that she did to her patients that I think are unethical. Like asking, he has a patient called Jacob that is addicted, quotation marks, to masturbation all his life, ever since he was a teenager, and he's Polish, and went to confess to a priest, to a Catholic priest, very much like I did. I'm also a recovering Catholic. And the priest just enhanced his guilt, and he got into this guilt trap about masturbation, in which he will masturbate and then feel very guilty about it, which involves dopamine for sure, because conflict and error correction, and that releases dopamine, that activates the dopamine system. So at some point, Anna Lembke told him, get on your knees and ask God for forgiveness for having masturbated. This is to a man that was pretty much my age, in his 60s, okay? And I mean, that sounded to me like conversion therapy. And conversion therapy is illegal in California. Okay, and she's practicing in California. So I was surprised that not only that she will do that, but she will write that in a book.
She says that it was let's see if I can remember. She said that she believed in belief and that she knew that he had been raised Catholic, so she thought it would help him to overcome his compulsive behavior. I will admit I was a little bit surprised when I read that as well, because it wasn't exactly what I was expecting from a therapy session.
Yeah, and, I mean, we will discuss this, but there is a lot of debate these days. It's very controversial whether addictions and drugs, addictive drugs, do the same thing. And so she comes very hard on the side that that behaviors can be addictive. But she starts throwing things in, like she starts with masturbation and sex, and then continues with gambling and shopping. But then she starts saying things like, pain can also be addictive because, masochists are addicted to pain, supposedly. And work can also be addictive. Flow, which is like one of the most wonderful mental states and you can be in, is addictive. Everything is addictive. She confessed that she was addicted to reading romance novels, which, baffled me because I write romance novels. Well, my novels can be classified as romance. They are kind of go way, way beyond romance. But it's like, I can see how one can like reading a lot. My daughter went through a phase where she was reading a lot. And I was just, this is wonderful. This is wonderful. Everybody should be addicted to reading, because you learn so much just by reading.
She says that in her experience, she read so many novels that by the time she stopped, she for 2 weeks was having a sort of anxious feeling in bed, which sounds strange to say the least. I can't imagine such an experience with books. But would you agree that even though, well, first of all, let's back up here. Would you say that non-drug stimuli can be addictive at all?
No, I don't think so. I think that what cocaine, amphetamines, opioids, alcohol, nicotine do to your brain is completely different of what any behaviors do to your brain. And later on, we will get into the neuroscience of it. I started with a very soft opinion on this because I read a book by a neuroscientist that I also respect a lot called David Linden. It all started when I listened to David Linden talking about his book in a neuroscience conference called Winter Conference in Brain Research. This was like 15 years ago. So I bought the book called The Compass of Pleasure. And it's the first book I read on the reward system, the dopamine pathway. Dopamine was not very much in fashion at the time. And at some point in the book, David Linden said, yeah, I do believe that sex is addictive. But recently, when I went back to the book and said, okay, well, he said that, how does he back it up? There is any reference to a scientific paper? No reference to scientific paper. And then I realized that the Compass of Pleasure, very much like Dopamine Nation, they don't have scientific reference supporting the statement that they do. They just have a reference list at the end. But they don't write like scientists do, where we say X and then we quotation supporting X, and then we say Y and then quotation supporting Y. So it's very difficult to, when somebody writes a book like that, to go back and say, okay, where is the evidence behind this? Where is the paper that supports this assertion? It's up to you to find it. And when you go chase for it.
And for anybody who hasn't read a scientific paper, they are replete with citations. All the claims, they have their little citations linked right there.
Yes. And that's the way we do science, because then everybody can go back and check the paper and see if the paper really says what the author of the book is saying. So that's what I'm doing right now. And I have been doing research for a month on the dopamine system, on top of the research I did a year ago, trying to find the answer to the question of, is sex addictive? Is masturbation addictive? Which is part of a wider question of, are behavior addictive? So this is very, very hotly debated. This is very controversial, okay? I'm not going to say that I'm reflecting a consensus, but there is a sort of consensus because the DSM-5, which is the book, is the diagnostic manual that psychology used to diagnose mental diseases. It doesn't recognize any behavioral addiction. The only one that it recognizes is gambling. But it doesn't recognize that sex is addictive. It doesn't say that porn is addictive. It doesn't say that masturbation is addictive. Furthermore, Anna Lembke says that cannabis, is addictive. I have studied the neurochemistry of cannabis and CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors and GPR55 very extensively. I have published a paper myself on that. The consensus is that marijuana is not addictive. It seems to be addicted or create a compulsion in like 10% of the population. But for most people, it's not addictive. Of course, psychotropic substances like magic mushrooms, psilocybin. Yeah, LSD, mescaline. Those substances are not addictive at all. In fact, they are kind of anti-addictive. Is when you take them, you think twice about taking them again because they are very demanding on you. They show you who you really are, and sometimes you don't want to go through that experience again.
So you made quite a few claims, and I'm sure the listener is probably thinking, oh yeah, well, why does he say that? Why should I listen to him? And I want to put a bookmark on that for now and go to more the basics. The reason I even started questioning Dopamine Nation at all and Huberman's ideas, Dr. Huberman's ideas on dopamine, is because I was reading Pleasures, Pleasures of the Brain, I believe, and it's by various authors, but among them, Dr. Kent Berridge. And I read his section on dopamine and wanting and liking. He wrote about wanting and liking and how dopamine was responsible for wanting and not liking. Liking being the pleasurable, rewarding response to a stimulus. For example, the actual enjoyment of eating a piece of chocolate, let's say. Whereas wanting is the desire to get up from the couch and go to the fridge and get the chocolate. And he was arguing that dopamine was responsible for the wanting phenomenon and not the liking phenomenon. And I thought, that conflicts with my current model of dopamine, because mine was from Dr. Huberman and Dopamine Nation. And they seem to, while both of them say that they mention in passing that dopamine is probably more motivation and wanting than liking and pleasure, they go on to seemingly, I don't know if this is pure scientific inaccuracy or just oversimplification, but they seem to conflate dopamine with pleasure itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like Dr. Anna Lembke. The book is about dopamine, and she talks about more pleasure, and then you increase in dopamine, and then you go to pain, right? For anyone who's read the book, you'll understand that. If you haven't, essentially she seems to conflate dopamine with pleasure a lot. Dr. Huberman gave me the same impression in his podcasts on dopamine, although I haven't heard those in a while. I refreshed myself on Dopamine Nation a few days ago, but I haven't heard the podcast from Huberman in a while, so I may be somewhat incorrect. But in researching for my conversation with Dr. Berridge, I was very confused, because it seems as though dopamine doesn't cause pleasure at all. So does dopamine even cause pleasure?
Oh, yes. The answer is more complicated than that.
Of course. This is neuroscience after all.
So, several things. First of all, dopamine is, there is a great book that you may want to read, okay? It's called The Science of Orgasm. And it's the book about the neuroscience of sex. It's the best book about the neuroscience of sex that I know about. But by far, more informative than anything that I have read. And it's written by what I consider the two best sexologists in the world today, which is Barry Komisaruk, which is a man, and Beverly Whipple, who is a woman. And I have been following their papers for a while. And then I realized they wrote a book, so I'm reading the book. Okay, but going back to your question. So dopamine is essential, especially in males, for anything sexual. Dopamine is pro-sex. It's required for arousal and is required for ejaculation. The question about females is a little bit more complicated, but it seems to be the same. The problem is that a lot of research has been done in rats, and dopamine is very confusing in rats because it makes them move around when they get sexually excited. And that complicates measuring the arousal of rat. I won't go into that. The key is that, dopamine is pro-sex, serotonin is anti-sex. That's the short soundbite. But dopamine is pro-sex, not on the reward pathway, which is where drugs produce addiction, but it's a different dopaminergic pathway that is in the hypothalamus and connects with the release of oxytocin in the pituitary gland. So dopamine is essential for the sexual response there. Now, pleasure, that's a very tricky thing, because there is no pleasure center in the brain. And certainly the reward pathway and the nucleus accumbens is not a pleasure center in the brain. Pleasure is like everything that happens in the brain, it involves the whole brain. There is the nuclei in the brain on the neural pathways. They don't act isolated from each other. They are constantly talking to each other. If I had to point to a pleasure system in the brain, I will point at the insula, which is a part of the cortex that gets invaginated inside of the white matter of the hemisphere, forming an island. That's why it's called the insula. And it looks like the insula activates by everything that feels good and everything that feels bad. It's like an emotional part of the brain where we say, we like this, we don't like that. Orgasm activates the insula. The entrance of the insula is activated in sadomasochistic play, in masochist. But disgust also activates the insula. Now, in the reward pathway, Dr. Berich is right. It's mostly about wanting and not about liking. However, when we experience pleasure, it is true that the nucleus accumbens get activated. And not just with things like sex and food and drugs. When we listen to music and we like the music, the nucleus accumbens gets activated. So there is a little bit of a liking response that involves the nucleus accumbens. Like this liking and pleasure response activates a series of centers in the brain and the nucleus accumbens. The reward pathway is one of them. And let me back off a little bit. Let me explain what the nucleus accumbens is. So there is a reward pathway that goes from, is in a part of the brain that is kind of in the middle of the brain towards the bottom, called the striatum, okay? And there is the dorsal striatum and the ventral striatum. In the ventral part of the striatum, which is like the bottom of the striatum, there is a neuronal pathways that use dopamine that goes from the ventral tegmental area, which we call it VTA, to the nucleus accumbens, and secrete dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Now, way back in the 50s, there were a couple of scientists that were doing research on the sleep-wake cycle, and they were putting electrodes in the reticular formation in rats to see if they would fall asleep or they stay awake. But one day they made a mistake and put one of those electrodes in that pathway that goes from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens, which we call the reward pathway. The scientific name is the Mesolimbic pathway, but we're going to call it the reward pathway. So they put an electrode there, and they realized that the rat will always go to the corner of the square where they will press the button for to stimulate that pathway. So the rat seems to like being stimulated there. So later on, they put the rat in a cage with a lever where if the rat press the lever, it will stimulate the reward pathway. So the rat will go there and press the lever and press the lever and press the lever. It would not eat, it will not drink, it will not do anything but press the lever. So they were very surprised, and they saying, oh, the rat must feel a lot of pleasure when it presses the lever. That's why it does it so many times. So eventually they did the same thing in people, and they put the electrode in the reward pathway of people, and sure enough, the people will press the button to stimulate. But what people say is like, it's not really that I feel pressure, it's that I just have to press that button. They feel a compulsion to press the button. And that's where the research on the reward pathway started. And we're talking back in the 60s, so almost 50 years ago. And a lot of work has been done since then. What they found is that addictive drugs, what they do is they produce dopamine release in the reward pathway. So the reward pathway acts by the nerves that goes from the VTA ends in the nucleus accumbens, and they release dopamine there. What drugs of addiction do is they increase the amount of dopamine that gets released and the amount of time that dopamine stays there in that system. Okay. There are two main categories of addictive drugs: the psychostimulants, amphetamine and cocaine. What they do is they inhibit the system that takes the dopamine away from the synapses and puts them back inside the cells. That's called the reuptake system. So cocaine inhibits the reuptake of dopamine. Amphetamines reverse the reuptake system of dopamine. So instead of putting dopamine in the cells, it expels more dopamine out. And opioids form parts of a system that inhibits dopamine release. So what opioids do is they inhibit the neurons that inhibit dopamine release. This is called disinhibition. So when you take opioids, there is more dopamine release because there is no inhibition of dopamine release. And those are the two.
I have to interject here for a moment.
Yeah.
To make this really, really simple for someone with zero neuroscience background, the reward pathway is roughly, it's between two areas. To make this to oversimplify a bit, you have the VTA and you have the nucleus accumbens. The VTA neurons communicate with the nucleus accumbens using dopamine because neurons, they communicate using chemicals, roughly. And when you say that reuptake is blocked, the way two neurons communicate is you have the two neurons, and then you have the synapse, which is it's the gap between the neurons. This is where they send chemicals across. So one neuron will send dopamine to the other neuron, and this will cause it to do other things. But when you say that cocaine and amphetamines block reuptake, what happens is one neuron sends dopamine out, and that dopamine enters the receptors of the other neuron, and that's what causes things to happen, effects from the dopamine, or any neurotransmitter really. And then reuptake pulls those dopamine molecules back into the first neuron, or breaks them down. And then what cocaine and amphetamine are doing is they're blocking the reuptake of the dopamine. So there's more dopamine in this gap, and so there's more dopamine to enter the receptors. Is that correct? Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm glad you did that, because sometimes I forget that I really need to simplify these things for everybody.
The curse of knowledge.
Everybody to understand what a reuptake system is. Okay.
Oh, and for the opioids and disinhibition, essentially the way that works is you have neurons that release opioids, then you have GABA neurons.
Exactly.
And for the listener, if you're getting overwhelmed with the detail, don't worry. It doesn't really matter. I'll simplify. Opioid neurons, GABA neurons, and then dopamine neurons here. So what the opioid neurons release, they release endorphins in this case, which enter receptors in the GABA neuron. And this inhibits the GABA neuron. So it's essentially putting the brake on the neuron. So now the GABA neuron releases less GABA. What GABA does in relation to the dopamine pathways, it releases, so the GABA neuron releases GABA, which enters the dopamine neuron and puts the brake on it. So what's happening is the GABA neuron is putting the brake on dopamine neurons so that they release less dopamine. When you, with an opioid neuron, put the brake on the GABA neuron, it's taking the brake off of the dopamine neuron. So that is, you're inhibiting the GABA neuron and disinhibiting the dopamine neuron. And so what this does is it makes the dopamine neurons release more dopamine in the, quote, reward pathway. Is there any corrections, anything you'd add to that?
No, that's wonderful. Thank you for that explanation again. It's a wonderful explanation. Because this is going to get far more complicated. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible. But there is some key details that on the key question, which is, are behavior addictive? In particular, is sex addictive? That key question, to answer it, we need to understand some very important details that are kind of heavy-duty neuroscience, so not easy to explain. So let's start with this. When a behavior like sex stimulates the reward pathway, what happens is that the neurons that release dopamine, they fire in bursts. When we record action potentials in electrophysiology, in neuroscience, we sometimes use a sound, a speaker, to tell us what a sound's potential is coming, so we can hear the action potential. So when you're recording and a neuron is firing a low frequency, you will hear bop, 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 bop. When it has a high frequency, you will hear prrrr. And when it fires a burst, you will hear prr, 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 prr. Get it? Okay, so what releases dopamine is neurons firing in bursts. Prr, 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 prr. And every burst produces a very quick peak of dopamine release that is quickly taken away by the reuptake system that you explained so well. Okay? So that's one thing. So drugs, they don't really, what happens is that they inhibit either the reuptake system or the system that is keeping the system down. So there is, instead of just this sharp peak of dopamine, what you get is a long, very high level of dopamine being released. Okay?
So it's something like, rather than what would normally happen is your dopamine is at baseline, then peak, and it comes back down. It peaks, but then there is no come down because there's no reuptake, and it kind of stays there for a while until the reuptake returns later.
Yeah. And that's completely unnatural. And that's what drives the addiction. So I want to emphasize that is how a behavior and a drug activates differently the dopamine system. Okay. So now let's talk about the dopamine receptors, which is the other key part of the information here. And this is hugely important. So
actually, before you talk about the dopamine receptors,
okay.
I want to take one step back for someone who has no neuroscientific background. And that's, what is dopamine actually doing in the brain, in the reward pathway, and relating to rewards? So what is it? What is the function of dopamine in the brain, and what's the phenomenology? So what are you feeling when dopaminergic activity is occurring in the brain?
Okay. So we need to, there is another piece of information that has been missing here, and we need to call it. Is that we have been talking about so far I have told you about two dopamine systems. One that drives sex, which is in the hypothalamus. The other one is the reward pathway. Now, let's bring another third player here. It's called the mesocortical dopamine pathway. The VTA not only projects to the nucleus accumbens, it projects to the brain cortex. And two areas of the brain cortex that are very important for our behavior. One is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is a part of the cortex is that if you visualize the brain and the two hemispheres, there is a part of the hemisphere where they touch, and there is a crevice between them. Well, the cingulate cortex is hidden inside that crevice. And what it does is it plans our action. It tells us we need to do something, and this is how we're going to do it. And the other part of the brain that does that is the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of behind our forehead. And that's kind of the director, is what inhibits us from doing things impulsively and control our behaviors. And it's like it's like the guard, is keeping an eye of everything that's happening in the brain and keep us going. And when we need to work hard, is what's keeps the things going and keeps our focus, attention, and all that. And both parts of the cortex, the arteriocingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex, they need dopamine to do that. If they don't have dopamine, they just crash. They don't have power. Dopamine is kind of the battery that is powering those things. Is what is telling, keep going, keep going, keep going. Okay? So phenomenologically, as you said, the way dopamine feels in us is when imagine we were running a marathon, or we're doing some hard sport, lifting weights, whatever your favorite sport is. What keeps you going is dopamine. It's, come on, keep going, stay with it. When you're working, when you're writing a paper, when you're studying, what keeps you going, what keeps that attention focusing is dopamine. When you get in flow, that magic state that happens in a sport like rock climbing, which I love, or writing, which is the other thing that I love, you enter in flow, and after a period of struggle, you are just cruising, and everything becomes easy, and you feel so motivated, and the whole world disappears, and you're just on your writing, or on your climbing, or whatever you're doing. That magical state, that's dopamine. That's what it feels like to have a lot of dopamine stimulating your cortex and keeps you going.
Would you say it's the intense attention to it, the immersement in the task?
Yes.
Is that what the dopamine is producing phenomenologically?
Dopamine phenomenologically, what it feels like is mental energy. It's when you feel energized, when you feel motivated.
Does it also give a sensation of desire, or of even, what would it be, like a compulsion to get something?
Yes.
Or is that a decrease in dopamine?
No, that's an increase in dopamine. But there is several states here. One other state that is very important to underline is the state of craving. When we really want something, I really need that chocolate cake. I really need to get that girl. I really need to get that boy. Or craving is, I don't know what it is, but I need something. My life feels so empty, and whatever I do is not it's like the Rolling Stone. I can get no satisfaction. And that song? It's a very old song. Well, that state, I can get no satisfaction. That state of craving, that's also dopamine. That's lack of dopamine. And that's why we need to talk about the dopamine receptors.
Right.
So,
and let's get into that. I think that's probably the part of your article that I thought was written best. This conversation, by the way, is based on an article that you wrote, which I think is excellent. It will be linked in the description. Very clear. Great explanation, I think. So talk to me about dopamine receptors.
Well, there are 5 dopamine receptors. Okay, and they are very boringly named D1, D2, D3, D4, D5. Okay, but there's a lot of receptors, but nothing compared with the dopamine receptor, which has 16 receptors. Okay, so so dopamine has 5, and they are classified in 2 families. So D1 and D5 go together in what is called the D1 family. D2, D3, D4, they are bunched together in what is called the D2 family. The D1 and the D2 receptors are the most abundant ones. They are 10 to 100 times more abundant than the D3, D4, and D5. So to simplify things, we're going to talk about D1 receptors and D2 receptors. With the caveat that when I talk about D2 receptors, that will include D3 receptors also. Okay. But I'm not going to make it more complicated than it needs to be.
Right. Those details are irrelevant to the user of the brain.
Okay. So the D1 and the D2 receptors, they do opposite things. Here it gets a little complicated. There are type of receptors that are called G protein coupled receptors. So G protein coupled receptors are proteins that are sitting in the membrane. Okay, the G protein is a protein that comes from inside the cell and attaches to the receptor, and it forms by 3 subunits called alpha, beta, and gamma. And there are different G proteins depending on the alpha subunit. Some alpha subunits called alpha I are inhibitory because they inhibit intracellular signals carried by a molecule called cyclic AMP. There is another alpha G protein called alpha S, which stimulates the synthesis of cyclic AMP. So S stands for stimulatory, I stands for inhibitory, and that's the only thing that your audience needs to remember about this. So D1 receptors, alpha S, they are stimulatory. They increase cyclic AMP. D2 receptors, alpha I, they are inhibitory. They inhibit cyclic AMP. Okay? So D1 stimulate, D2 inhibit. What do they stimulate? The firing of the second neuron, the neuron that receives the input from the dopamine. And there's going to be neurons in the nucleus accumbens that stimulates this wanting feeling, or there are going to be neurons in the brain that stimulates this motivation, this drive, this focus attention. Okay, those are going to be D1 receptors that are stimulatory. The D2 receptors sit on the nucleus accumbens and they inhibit neurons. And one of the neurons they inhibit are the neurons that secrete dopamine. These are called autoreceptors because they are receptors on the same neuron that releases the neurotransmitter. Okay? Okay, so the D2 receptors inhibit the nucleus accumbens. And the other important things about the D1 and the D2 receptors. The D1 receptors have low affinity for dopamine. So you need a lot of dopamine to stimulate the D1 receptors. The D2 receptors have high affinity for dopamine. So tiny little amounts of dopamine can stimulate those receptors. So the VTA neurons in the reward pathways, normally they go like this. Pop, 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 pop. That means they fire action potentials of very low frequency. And that releases tiny little amounts of dopamine. And those tiny little amounts of dopamine are high enough to stimulate the D2 receptors, but not to stimulate the D1 receptors. When that happens, you are in a state of satisfaction. No cravings. It's like, I don't need anything. I'm just cool, man. I'm chilling. Don't need to do stuff. I have no cravings. I have no desires. I'm just chilling. But and that also sets a baseline that when something comes in and say, hey, wake up, we need to do something, and the neurons go, prr, 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 then the dopamine gets released, the D1 receptors get activated, the D2 receptors stay down, and boom, you get motivated. Okay? You may be, some people, unfortunately, had either low amounts of D2 receptors or low amounts of dopamine release. So those people are restless. They are never satisfied. they may have ADHD. They cannot concentrate, and that's because the D2 system stays very low. So they live in this permanent state of looking for something to do, something to satisfy this desire. And that's what happens also when you get addicted to drugs. You get into this permanent state of craving. I'm going to explain now. Later, we will get into what that happens. It's because the D2 receptors disappear.
I want to emphasize, I want to tie this together very quickly because I think this is a critical idea. This is related to what if anyone has listened to Dr. Huberman's episode on dopamine, he talks about the distinction between tonic and phasic release. Tonic release is like the dopamine baseline. It's what you said, the little fire, pop, pop. It's a low level but constant release of dopamine. And so this is what is activating our D2 receptors, making us feel satisfied. So that baseline keeps us satisfied over time. And then the phasic release, which is the bursts, the prop, that is what causes the dopamine peak, I suppose, and creates that feeling of wanting. It's presumably it's activated upon the encounter of a sensory stimulus. You might see something or smell something or hear something that promises a reward. And the brain says, well, the dopaminergic reward pathway activates and says, pay attention and want to this. This is going to confer a reward. Would you say that's an accurate explanation?
Yeah. So let's list things that might activate the dopamine system. One, it's not always good stuff. Imagine that you're a primitive caveman and you are out and you encounter a lion, a predator. That activates the dopamine system. It activates the noradrenergic fight and flight response, but also activates the dopamine system and says, get the hell out of here before you get eaten. Or imagine that you find you're a man and you find a very sexy woman, or you're a woman and you find a very sexy man. That activates the dopamine. Oh, I want that, Or you have you saw some great food, I want to eat that. Boom. All those things activate the D1 system, good things and bad things. Or if you get injured or you're in pain, that activates the dopamine system too. I want to get rid of the pain, So pain, not only pleasure, but pain and fear and disgust, positive and negative emotions, they activate the dopamine system. What the dopamine system does is tells you, get going, do something, because either there is something we want or there is something we don't want.
I heard Dr. Daniel Lieberman in his book, The Molecule of More, put it excellently, that dopamine is essentially concerned with the domain of the distant. So you have the here and now, which would be something like endorphins, serotonin, etc., those molecules, the ones that are telling us right now, for example, I am experiencing a pleasurable stimulus. And then dopamine is responsible for distance, for change in some sense. And that can be physical distance, go over there and get this, or temporal distance. In the future, I can get something else. But it's fundamentally responsible for the desire for change, for a change in state, which can be, I want this positive thing, or perhaps I want to not have this negative thing. Do you think that's an accurate explanation of what it's doing?
Yeah. So let's talk about addictive drugs. So people have been doing research for a long, long time, ever since, that experiment in the 50s with the reward pathway. And then, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, what was created. There was a lot of political drive to do research on drug abuse. So NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, got a lot of funded a lot of research. So there is tons and tons of research done on dopamine and the reward pathway. And what they found is that can be summarized in very simple things. The drugs of addiction produce massive and sustained dopamine release, which is unnatural because natural stimuli produce peaks in dopamine. But the dopamine goes up and down very quickly. But a substance of abuse, yes, release a lot of dopamine, much more than even the peak. And then they sustain the release. And what that does is it downregulates the D2 receptors. So let me explain. So when a receptor sees the neurotransmitter, it sends a signal through the G protein and all that we explained already. But it also it makes the receptor to bunch in the membrane, and then it bunches and it goes inside the membrane and disappears from the cell surface. That's called internalization. When a receptor gets internalized, two things can happen to it. It goes back to the cell membrane after about 30 minutes, and everything goes back to normal. Or it gets degraded in a cell compartment called lysosomes, where there is a bunch of proteases that chew the receptors up. So the receptor doesn't have the chance to go back to the cell surface. If it doesn't go back, well, the cell can make more receptors from DNA, produce mRNA, it goes to the ribosome, more receptors get made. Well, what happened with the substance of abuse is that there is so much dopamine and for so long that the D2 receptors get internalized, they come back up, they see still the dopamine is there, they go back and internalize again, and eventually they get chewed up in the lysosomes. And also there's probably a signal to tell the cell not to make any more D2 receptors. So the D2 receptors disappear. That's called downregulation of the D2 receptors. So what substance of abuse do is they downregulate the D2 receptors, and that lasts months and years on end. You lost the D2 receptors and they are gone for a long, long time. And you need to abstain for drugs for these receptors to come back. And that happens with cocaine, and it happens with amphetamine, and it happens with opioids, and it happens with nicotine, and it happens with alcohol. It happens. All the drugs of abuse downregulates the D2 receptors. So that's what scientists call the hallmark of drug addiction, is the downregulation of the D2 receptors.
And for the listener to remember, the D1 receptors are the ones that take a lot of dopamine to activate, and those are the ones that stimulate desire. They also, I believe they produce learning, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They produce learning in the cells where the synapses strengthen. Essentially, the communication between two neurons, the brain says that, oh, this is an important thing. I should learn to pay more attention to it. So the connection between the two neurons related to the drug of abuse strengthened so that they were able to more easily fire later on. And you illustrated this excellently in your article, that where the D1 receptor is something, this is how I thought of it. You illustrated it a bit differently, but the D1 receptor is something like a cup. You get a lot of dopamine, fills up the cup, but then it kind of spills over the edges and fills D2 receptors. And then when you have the reuptake inhibition, meaning there's a lot of dopamine in the synapse and it's not getting taken out, that's when it starts, as you said, down-regulating the D2 receptors and decreasing it. And if the listener remembers, the D2 receptors were responsible for a sense of satisfaction, of inhibiting the intense wanting. So these people these addicted individuals, they start to get strengthening of the connections, as a result of a D1 receptor between neurons in the VTA and neurons associated with the drug itself.
Exactly.
And whereas the other connections not related to the drug, they start to get culled. They start to get pulled back. Down regulation occurs. And it seems to separate the drug as an intense signal from the noise of other things.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's emphasize one thing that you just said, but it's important to remark, is that what the D2 receptors do is that everything that surrounds something that is important gets highlighted and gets remembered. So what happens with drugs is that, they activate the D1 receptors, and the D1 receptors remember the memory of that. Oh, taking the drugs activate the dopamine system, so it must be important. So let's take more drugs and create that association. And every time you take the drug, it gets reinforced. So that drug-taking behavior slightly takes over more and more of the nucleus accumbens and wipes away, push away all the other motivation that you have, until the drug addict, the main motivation in their life is taking drugs and chasing after the drugs, and anything else is not important anymore. Okay? But there's the other side, is that the D2 receptors are downregulated. So now you cannot get satisfaction. You are in that Rolling Stone song state of, I can get no satisfaction. No matter what you do, sex doesn't satisfy me, food doesn't satisfy me, work doesn't satisfy me, social interaction doesn't satisfy me. I don't know what I want. And then the D1 receptors are saying, what you want is drugs. Okay? So that's drug addiction. Okay? What about behaviors that are supposedly to be addicted? Well, here's the main thing. No behavior downregulates the D2 receptors. They don't downregulate the D2 receptors. In fact, people say that exercise is addictive. People say that they are workaholics and they get addicted to work. Well, guess what? Exercise is the main upregulators of the D2 receptors. If you exercise a lot, you get more D2 receptors in your nucleus accumbens. That's why when people exercise a lot, they are also very satisfied people. They are contented. It's like, oh man, I just ran a marathon. I feel so great. Boom, the D2 receptors goes up. Work, the same thing. Social interaction, the same thing. There is also some evidence, not a lot, but growing evidence that meditation and mindfulness upregulates the D2 receptors. And sex, it doesn't downregulate the D2 receptors. No evidence whatsoever that it downregulates the D2 receptors in the nucleus accumbens. But guess what? In the medial preoptic area, that area in the hypothalamus that is involving arousal and ejaculation in men, and probably arousal also in women, sex upregulates the D2 receptors in the medial preoptical area. So what sex does is makes you more sexual. So two things. Drugs downregulates the D2 receptors. Behaviors don't upregulate the D2 receptors. In fact, some behaviors that are healthy. Another thing that upregulates the D2 receptors is rich environment. It's when you are with a lot of stimulation around you. That upregulates the D2 receptors. So
that's why it's harder to make a rat addicted to a drug when they're in a rich environment. I'd read that in regards to studies on addictive drugs, but I never knew the mechanism behind it.
Exactly. That's it. They upregulate the D2 receptors. But, there are articles that say rich environment is addictive. Why? Because when you expose a rat to a rich environment, they want more of it. Of course. We all want more of the good things, the good stuff. Good food, good sex, good environments, work that is satisfactory and creative, good exercise that makes us feel good. We all want the good stuff, but that's not being addictive. We just want it. Now, there are compulsive behaviors. Okay. And here's the other thing, is that there is such a thing of too much dopamine. You can have too much dopamine. Having too little D2 receptors is bad. Having too many D2 receptors is also bad. And that's why so you have two opposite things that look similar. You have drug addiction and you have compulsive behaviors. And they look similar because people tend to do those things a lot, take more drugs or do the compulsive behavior a lot. But in fact, when you look at the dopamine system, they are doing the opposite things. One is downregulating the D2 receptors. The other one is upregulating the D2 receptors. So when you have too much dopamine, what it looks like is like a person that is addictive or does work compulsively. It's a person that is so driven that it cannot let go. It cannot let go. It needs to go to work. It needs to go to work on Saturday and also on Sunday because work is so rewarding and there is so much stuff to do, and he gets displeasure when these things gets done. But it's not really pleasure because it's just too much. And he's in a state of constant insatisfaction. It's like he doesn't have enough D2 receptors, but in fact, he has a lot of D2 receptors. He has, in fact, too many D2 receptors. That is driving him too strongly. So,
how are the D2 receptors driving him strongly? I thought they were responsible for satisfaction. If you have more, what does that change?
That's something that I'm still puzzling about, to be honest. And I don't want to make this too complicated, but there are two types of D2 receptors. And I hinted at that at the beginning. Well, there are D2 receptors that are postsynaptic, that are in the other neurons, but are also D2 receptors in the presynaptic neuron.
So to make that very clear, there are two neurons. One is talking to the other. The presynaptic receptors are in the one that's doing the talking. They're before, so here's the synapse. Here's the neuron after the synapse, the postsynaptic neuron, the presynaptic neuron before the synapse. So the presynaptic receptors are in this neuron, and the postsynaptic ones are in this neuron. So that's the distinction, right?
Yeah. So the presynaptic D2 receptors, they turn off the spigot of dopamine. That's what they do. So it's a feedback mechanism so when there is too much dopamine release, the D2 receptors get activated and they shut off dopamine release. So dopamine is very, very heavily controlled. So that's also why the drugs of addiction get things out of control, but because they downregulate those D2 receptors. So there's no more control on the dopamine release. So let's hit about something that Andrew Huberman is wrong here too, because I think it's important. He says that you have to take more tyrosine, L-Tyrosine, which is an amino acid, because that way you make more dopamine. So yeah, dopamine gets made from the amino acid L-Tyrosine by an enzyme called tyrosine hydroxylase, which makes another molecule called Dopa, which then gets converted into dopamine. Okay. Now, when you have a chain of biochemical reactions, there is always one step that is a bottleneck. Is the rate controlling step. Well, in the synthesis of dopamine, the rate controlling step is tyrosine hydroxylase that converts tyrosine into Dopa. Okay. So you can take tons of tyrosine. It doesn't matter. Because tyrosine hydroxylase are going to sit there and say, I'm not making more Dopa. And why is tyrosine not making more Dopa? Well, because the D2 receptors are telling them tyrosine hydroxylase, hey, stay low. Too much dopamine, stay low.
So the brain essentially counters, you take the tyrosine to get more dopamine, and the brain realizes that there's a lot of tyrosine, and it essentially tamps down the production to keep it stable.
Yes, exactly. It goes back to the D2 receptor. The D2 receptor is the boss. Here. It controls tyrosine hydroxylase. So no matter how much tyrosine you take, it's not going to do anything. But you can cheat that because what tyrosine hydroxylase does is make Dopa. So you can take Dopa instead of tyrosine. And then you cheat the D2 receptors and the tyrosine hydroxylase because L-Dopa gets just converted into dopamine right away.
You skip the step.
Yeah. So why don't we take L-Dopa? Instead of what Andrew Huberman says in 10 times, Dopa is cheap, Dopa is the main medication that is given to Parkinson patients because there is a fourth dopamine pathway that goes to a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And in Parkinson's disease, what happens is that these dopamine neurons starts to die. Substantia nigra controls fine movement. So that's why Parkinson patients get tremors. So you give them Dopa. You cheat the tyrosine hydroxylase, and the brain starts making more dopamine. And that controls Parkinson's disease because now there is enough dopamine to keep the movement. Okay. But what happens is that dopamine doesn't only get made in the dopaminergic neurons, which are the neurons that secrete dopamine. But serotonin neurons that normally don't secrete dopamine, they start making dopamine too. So there is a lot of dopamine going around. But the serotonin neurons that are now making dopamine, they don't have the D2 receptors to keep an eye on the dopamine system, and they don't have reuptake mechanism. So they make dopamine willy-nilly, too much dopamine. Also, even in the dopamine neurons, there is so much dopamine going made that the synaptic vesicles that store dopamine, they become gigantic, loaded with dopamine, and they secrete massive amounts of dopamine. Okay, so you need the Dopa in the Parkinson patient to keep the substantia nigra happy. But dopamine also gets made in the reward pathway. So now there's too much dopamine in the reward pathway. And in some of these patients, especially the ones that are young, that develop Parkinson's disease very early, they become hypersexual. They become obsessed with sex. They develop erections, spontaneous erections, spontaneous ejaculations, and they become obsessed with sex. And this is not, they become obsessed with sex. It's not that just, they get more erections and more arousals, but they become obsessed with, and some of them become obsessed with other compulsive behaviors like gambling, like shopping, mostly those things. Some of them overeat too. So this is what happens when you get too much dopamine. When you get the system, by the feeding the tyrosine hydroxylase bottleneck, when you make too much dopamine, you become obsessed with certain types of behaviors. And that's what resembles a little bit the behavioral addictions. So behavioral addictions happen in these Parkinson patients that take Dopa. Not only Parkinson's, the people with restless leg syndrome and with HDSD, sometimes they give them Dopa. And they are at risk to develop these obsessive behaviors. So when you have too much dopamine, you drive the D1 receptor system too strongly. You became hypermotivated to do some things, and some things become obsessive for you. And some people become obsessed about sex. Some people become obsessed about gambling. Some people become obsessed about working. You can become obsessed about anything. Anything that is a normal driver of behavior just can take over. You lose your balance. It becomes too much.
It seems like what you're saying is that the difference between an addiction and a compulsion, they're both potentially, well, addiction is definitely pathological, but a compulsion is a potentially pathological sort of obsession, fixation on a behavior where you want, it's like wanting out of control in some sense. But it seems like what you distinguish between these two is that the compulsive behavior is one where you get peaks in dopamine, which lead to strengthening, I presume, of leads to a lot of activity in the D1 receptors, which essentially strengthens the pathway saying, do this behavior more. But then addictions do the same thing, but they also downregulate the D2 receptors, which leads to this decrease in satisfaction and this hyper distinction between the signal of the drug and the noise of standard life. But it seems like you're saying that, and also my interpretation was that these people taking L-Dopa can actually become behaviorally addicted, but the addiction per se, as opposed to a compulsion, can only occur when there is an artificial tampering with the dopaminergic system. So under natural conditions, such as exercise and the like, workaholism, those can only ever become compulsions, but not addictions per se, unless there is chemical tampering with the dopaminergic system. Is that an accurate summary of what you've said?
That's a very accurate. That's a very accurate description. And there is something that puzzles me that I really need to keep reading and doing research about this. And I'm getting very compulsive about this. I realize too much dopamine on my dopamine research. Is why doesn't L-Dopa is addictive? I didn't find any evidence so far that L-Dopa produces addiction when you give them to Parkinson patients or to other kind of patients. But it does the same thing as cocaine. It's just too much cerebral dopamine. But no, it produces compulsive behaviors, but it's not addictive in itself. So that's a question mark that I'm going to leave out there. The other thing is that in compulsive behaviors, it's not the reward pathway, it's the whole brain. And when we talk about something like work or even exercise, addictions, which are not addictions, they are compulsions, we need to look at the ego. And that's the medial prefrontal cortex that gets too active. And it's our self-image that I need to be successful. There is two emotions that drives human behavior, which is pride and shame. And those are the fundamental, those form the basis of the ego. So from our childhood, we get rewarded with pride and punished with shame for things we do. When we are successful, it's like, I'm so proud of you. You won that medal, doing gymnastics, or you got an A on that test. I'm so proud of you. Oh, I'm so ashamed of you. Why are your grades so bad? Why are you picking fights with your classmate? And that parent, that teacher gets internalized and becomes an internal parent, an internal teacher. And that's our ego. And it lives in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the prefrontal cortex where we are very self-aware of what we are doing. And the prefrontal cortex talks back to the nucleus accumbens and say, we need to work harder. We need to get better grades. And that activates the whole D1 system and drives us, and then the nucleus accumbens talk to the medial prefrontal cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex talk back to the nucleus accumbens, and it becomes a loop of stimulation and motivation. And that's good. That's what makes us do stuff in our life. But it can be too much, and it can make us miserable. And we call that an addiction. It's not an addiction, we have our value system all screwed up. We need to go look at our ego and see what is driving us. And maybe we're driving ourselves too much. Maybe we need to slow down.
There's like the cognitive control component of desire, essentially, where you're more more complex thoughts are feeding back into the reward pathway to drive your behavior.
Yeah. And gambling and those are things that make us hyper focus, and maybe they'll get us into a state of flow. And a state of flow is wonderful and it's very healthy, but it can be too much. We can get too used to get into particular state of flows, and we cannot live in a constant state of flow. We need to take a break. Daydreaming and the monkey mind that gets so criticized by the mindfulness crowd, that's good. We need to live in those mental states sometimes in our lives. We need to cycle through different mental states, through flow and mindfulness, but also daydreaming and relaxing and pleasure and enjoying ourselves and just wandering in the woods, not thinking about anything in particular. We need to balance our brain. Too little dopamine is bad. Too much dopamine is bad. We need to find our balance. And the way we do that is with introspection and knowing ourselves and listening to our bodies and listening to our minds and finding out what makes us happy. There is no magic bullets. L-Tyrosine doesn't work. Dopamine fasting doesn't work. Fab, no fab. It's stupid. We should experience pleasure in our lives.
Just avoid things that can legitimately become pathological, things that will actually create an addiction, and I'd say even a compulsion, if pathological.
When your life gets unbalanced, you're going to pay a price. You're going to be unhappy. Too much work, too little pleasure, too much pleasure. You need to strike a balance.
For all your criticisms of Dr. Lembke, you seem to come to a similar conclusion. Balance in the Age of Indulgence, I believe, is the subheading of her, or the subtitle of her book.
Yeah, but she doesn't do balance. She is against pleasure. Her way of balancing is no pleasure. Is don't experience too much pleasure. I said, no, experience too much pleasure. There is no such a thing as too much pleasure. Just don't get obsessed with it. So there is an article that I also written that I think is very important because I have been a Buddhist and I have thought a lot about craving and desire and all that. And I realized, there is a mantra that you can find in many places and in Dopamine Nation too, is that pleasure is what produces craving. So the story goes, you experience something that is pleasurable, then your reward system gets activated by that pleasure, and then you want more of that. And then you go find the pleasure, experience it again, and then you want more of that, and you want more and more and more pleasure. And that's craving. But that's not true. Pleasure does not produce craving. If you experience pleasure mindfulness, like mindfulness in sex, and mindfulness in eating, and you're really enjoying that food, and you're really enjoying that sex, and focusing on the pleasure. That's mindfulness. And then you let go. Pleasure is gone. You're satisfied. That's fine. Move on to the next thing. What produces craving is not pleasure. Produces craving is the ego. Craving is that I need to get better grades. I need to get better pay. I need to get that promotion. That's the real craving that is killing us. And that's not the dopamine system. That's not too much dopamine. That's the medial prefrontal cortex, driving you too hard.
That's more the cognitive level.
So what do we crave? We crave money. That's not pleasure. Money is not pleasure. We get the money and we don't even spend it getting much pleasure. We just want more money. We crave fame. We crave prestige. We crave status. Those are the cravings that are driving us. It's not pleasure. If it was just pleasure, it would be great. Just get a good food. Food is not all that expensive. Get good sex. Watch a good movie. Read a good book. That's pleasure. Listen to music. Pleasure. That's not bad. That's not what we crave. We don't stop. We don't have enough time to read good books. We don't have enough time to listen to good music. We don't have enough time to see good movies. We're just going to work, working extra hours or exercising compulsively not because exercise is good for us, because maybe exercise is driven by our ego.
It seems to be more so the insatiable cognitive desire of I should have more, that kind of thing. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. That's exactly it. That's the ego, is I should have more. I deserve more. That's why we want the best seat in the airplane and the first place in the line and the biggest slice of the cake. Not because those things are pleasurable, but because we deserve them. And that's ego.
Right. The brain isn't necessarily wired to say, I must get the newest iPhone and I must get it before anybody else. That's thoughts feeding back into the desire system.
That's craving. That's the ego.
I want to push back on this a little bit, because I'd say that I don't think it's the case that all craving is ego driven. To give some examples, gambling or pornography use, which create variable reward, which seems to stimulate dopamine in animal brains, lots of novelty. Do you think that's similar, analogous? I would say that's not necessarily ego driven, but rather something more of what is called a super normal stimulus in the common vernacular of lots of novelty. As I said earlier, variable reward, something that may be evolutionarily very salient, such as sex. What do you think about that?
It's complicated. Let's talk about gambling. Okay. Gambling is a very interesting phenomenon because it turns out that people that are really addicted to gambling, it looks like they are addicted to losing. They get this shock when they lose, and that is a dopamine shock, but it's also a noradrenaline shock. It's the fear-flight response. So it's complicated. Sex has a lot of ego too. When I don't watch a lot of porn, maybe my sexual life is very satisfied as it is, and I don't feel that compulsion. But so I don't know what drives people to watch so much porn. It's not just the sexual drive; it's something else. It's the whole experience of the intensity, and there is, a lot of porn that becomes so compulsive is kinky, and that impinges on my other main interest, because I'm writing a book on the neuroscience of kink.
Which explains to the listener who might be saying, why is he using sex as the example so often? That's why.
Yeah, because my career was on the neuroscience of pain. And when I retired, I felt like, it would be nice to study neuroscience of pleasure for a change. But also, I realized that the normal definition of pain, which is an adverse sensation that produces a negative emotional reaction, is not correct, because a lot of people seek pain. And it's not just sexual masochists. Think about the millions, maybe billions of people in the world that like spicy food. Well, eating spicy food is painful. It has a pain reaction. You just like that pain. You just like that burning in your mouth. That's what people do. And, it's uniquely human. There is no other mammal that likes capsaicing. If you want a squirrel to keep chewing on your bear seed, you just put a bunch of hot peppers in it and the squirrel will stay away. It's not that the squirrel say, spicy bear seed. No.
As someone who has inadvertently fed spicy food to my dog, I can verify that at least the non-human animals in my experience do not like it in the slightest.
Yeah, so that we are attracted to kink. We are attracted not just to pleasure, but to pain. We are attracted to seeing pain in others, and we're attracted to experiencing pain in ourselves. Not all kinds of pain, but some kinds of pain that we deem erotic. And what a lot of people seek in porn is not just sex. It's not just seeing a penis enters a vagina or tits or whatever. Is that narrative of conflict around sexual desire and about wanting and at the same time eluding pain. That was capture our attention. And it's funny because Anna Lembke, going back to dopamine, she confesses that she got addicted to romance novels. And romance novels are a little bit like the porn for women, because women are not so as visual as men. Women are more eroticized, more the sounds of a voice or narratives, complex narratives built around sexual attraction. And so romance and porn can become compulsive because we become entangled on those kinds of narratives.
Would you say that novelty in this specific example, gambling it makes quite a bit of sense just because of how expectation triggers the dopaminergic reward pathway, how novelty, well, it's not so much novelty, but it's more so expectation, reward prediction error, and so it makes sense why that triggers the dopaminergic system so much. It's because it's constantly, I could win. This next one could change my life. And then when you lose, it's even more your brain telling you, it's telling you desire the win, desire to get away from this loss.
You need to bring another system here, which is the noradrenergic system, which is hugely important, and the stress response. So what happens in gambling is very, very stressful. I have experienced that, like playing chess. It's like when you're about to lose, and you get so stressed, so driven, and so that fight or flight response can become very compulsive in itself. I do rock climbing, which is also deals a lot with the fight or flight response. And what happens in rock climbing is that when you get over the fear and you keep climbing and you know you're in danger, you get that hyper-focused state. You get into flow. It's a different state of flow. I think there are different states of flow, and this is a fear-driven flow where you use fear to achieve that hyper-focus. And that's very pleasurable, and you want it again. And I think that's what's similar to gambling. And that's very similar. That same thing happens in kink. Is in a BDSM scene, there is a lot of adrenaline release and fear response from the submissive. What happens in the top is that he gets in flow. So it's different states for each of them, but they are both states that are very rewarding. Eventually, the submissive gets into another state that we call subspace, which is a state of very, very high endorphin release, which is very pleasurable. And it's kind of a state of mental trance. But, the person watching porn probably doesn't get in subspace. It's not strong enough. What drives that person is probably a mixture of sexual attraction, but also the fight and flight response and the conflict of the narrative built around the sex.
I did a little scrounging the internet in preparation for this conversation, and it seems that some people have experiences with compulsion with pornography, whereas some others seem to use it in a completely non-pathological manner. Do you think that the compulsion, the reason that pornography perhaps is compulsive, whereas sex, standard sex, I suppose, seems to have a much lower rate of compulsion? Do you think that could just be because it's pushing on our dopaminergic triggers in a, I suppose, an unnatural way? You're getting more sexual variety than an emperor or a sultan would have hundreds of years ago. Nobody got that. Do you think that could push on dopamine a lot, making it, increasing the rates of compulsiveness? Still not enough to make it addictive, however. Do you think that could be the case?
I have a theory, and I want to go and continue my research on the literature to see if I can find some backing for it. Is that people that for which sex becomes compulsive and masturbation becomes compulsive tend to be either Christians or religious people or recovering religious people that have developed a lot of guilt around sex. So I think what happened with these people is that they go and they watch the porn, and then they experience, after they, have an orgasm and satisfy their sexual need, they crashed. There is a lot of prolactin release. Sex drive is going away, and then that uncovers a lot of guilt. And that contrast, that conflict between the pleasure and then the guilt, drives the dopamine system, which is the dopamine system is an error detecting system. And the same thing with the anterior cingulates. They are error detecting system. So when you create that conflict, their systems get tremendously activated and say, there is a lot of conflict here. Because I want to experience this pleasure, but I feel guilty experiencing this pleasure. And against the ego comes into play. So I think it's that conflict that creates the compulsion. And, when you read the story of Jacob in Dopamine Nation, the guy that, started masturbating when he was a teenager and tried to stop masturbating for all his life, it's just, he became obsessed about masturbating. But he became obsessed because it was so conflictive. Without the religious guilt, masturbation would have been just, get done, move on. But no, he cannot move on because after masturbating, he's loaded with all this guilt, so he has to do something about it. And that's what creates the compulsion. It's the conflict. It's not the pleasure.
You touched on this. Well, I thought about this when you were talking about how it can create a peak. It creates a dopaminergic peak, and then there's the trough due to the prolactin release. In Dopamine Nation, I actually want to read a quote. Science teaches us that every pleasure exacts a price, and the pain that follows is longer lasting and more intense than the pleasure that gave rise to it. With prolonged and repeated exposure to pleasurable stimuli, our capacity to tolerate pain decreases, and our threshold for experiencing pleasure increases.
That's bullshit. That's complete bullshit.
Okay, one moment to expound on the idea a little bit more. One of the main theses of Dopamine Nation is the existence of a so-called pleasure-pain balance, that when you push on the side of pleasure, afterward, your brain returns to a state of homeostasis, but then correspondingly tilts toward a side of pain. If you push on the pleasure side enough times, the depth of the pleasure will decrease over time with the same stimulus, and the depth of the pain will increase. That is one of the main theses of Dopamine Nation. What do you think about that?
That's bullshit. Pleasure and pain are not opposites. You can have pleasure and pain at the same time, as any masochist can attest. And in fact, pleasure and pain are driven by the same type of sensory fibers, the C fibers. Some of them are dedicated to pleasure, some of them are dedicated to pain. And then in the spinal cord, the whole thing gets mixed up, and pleasure, tactile sensation, and pain gets combined in very weird ways. So no, pleasure and pain are not are not opposites. And what Anna Lembke doesn't do is she doesn't define pain and pleasure very, very precisely. Which, for a pain neuroscientist like me is crucial. It's like, wait a second, pain is very complicated. Are we talking about chronic pain? Are we talking about thermal pain? Are we talking about acute pain? Or are we talking about emotions? Or are we talking about craving, insatisfaction, disgust, anger, shame?
There are lots of flavors of pain.
Yeah. And, so there is emotional pain and there is physical pain. And physical pain can produce emotional pleasure, as any masochist or capsaicin loving person can attest. So it's hugely complicated. As I told you before, adversive stimuli, so meaning something that we don't like, drive the reward pathway as strongly as pleasurable stimuli. But they both are motivators. So no, there is no balance. We don't pay. It's not true that any pleasure that we experience, we pay with pain. That's absolutely not true. There is good sex that leaves you completely satisfied and makes you a happy person and drives you a smile the next day. Oh my God, I have such a good sex last night. It's real. It happens to a lot of people. Only Puritans like Anna Lembke don't experience that. And they think that happened to other people because for them, pleasure is associated with guilt unconsciously, and they have not freed themselves from that association. You have a good meal, a healthy meal. You don't overeat, but you eat well, mindfully, a meal that your wife has cooked for you or you have cooked for your wife and put so much love in it. That's pleasure all around. That's good. That's good stuff. It builds love. It builds good relationships. It leaves you satisfied. The dopamine your D2 receptors are just firing along happily and saying, hey man, you don't need anything right now. Just have such a great meal and have such a good conversation with your wife or, with your friends.
So to make this extremely clear for the listener, are you saying that if I push on the pleasure side of my pleasure-pain balance, there is no reason to assume that it will necessarily tilt into pain?
No reason whatsoever.
It seemed that some of the evidence that Dr. Lembke took was from the opponent process theory of motivation. And there's a subsection of that, the opponent process theory of emotion, that essentially, whenever one experiences, I don't know if this is totally universal to emotions, but they give the example of addictive stimuli, that when one experiences the pleasure of the addictive stimulus, for example, there is a corresponding and opposite, the opponent process, the opposite of withdrawal or of some sort of pain like that.
That is true. That is true for addictive substances, but not for behaviors. That's my main message. What people are saying, what people are doing is taking all the research, which is massive, done on substance abuse and say the same thing applies to pleasure. And it's not true. It's not true. Yeah, cocaine makes you feel good right now, and tomorrow you're going to feel like shit. Well, actually, that doesn't happen for cannabis. Cannabis doesn't have a hangover. The next morning you probably feel better. So it's not true for every drug, but for cocaine and opioids and all that, yeah, you're gonna crash. You're gonna crash.
That's something I noticed when I was reading I didn't do all of them because there were many references, but I snooped around in the citations, the references section of Dopamine Nation. And because I was trying to figure out one of the other claims, and this is what I want to touch on next, is the idea that dopaminergic tolerance, what Lembke says is that when you push on the pleasure side, if you keep doing it with the same stimulus, you'll get less. So I thought, well, I'll get to that in a moment, but I was reading in the references and I thought, why would this be the case? I was looking, and all of the references that I read, again, I only read a small subsection of them, but every single one without exception was specific to consumption of drugs, the effect of drugs on the dopaminergic system. I think there was one on food in obese individuals, but the rest of them were all drugs. So my next question was that Dr. Lembke makes it seem that, and Dr. Huberman does talk about this as well, that dopaminergic tolerance leads to hedonic desensitization. So if I consume a high intensity dopaminergic stimulus, that over time I will it will lead to hedonic desensitization. The reward will decrease. Is that true?
Well, there is there is several things here. Let's start with the last one. Yeah, every stimulus desensitizes. So, if you hear a beep, a very loud beep, it feels very unpleasant at the beginning. You hear it again, it's less pleasant. You hear it again, it's less unpleasant. There is an exception of that. It's curious. Is that there is some research done a long time ago in the 50s on experienced Zen monks, and they were doing electro EEG of their brain responses. And a normal subject, when they hear an unpleasant beep, they have this EEG reaction to it, but they eventually desensitize. But the monks, they didn't, because they were in mindfulness. So for them, the stimulus was always relevant. That's just something that,
because they're paying such close attention to it every time they hear
no,
it.
because in the meditative state, your brain is hypersensitive. It's just so awake.
Right, because you're so fixated on just attending to experience.
Yeah, you're open to experience. But so yeah, most stimulus desensitize. So if you eat chocolate cake every day, yeah, after a while, it doesn't taste that good. You just get used to it. Which is just what.
Even intra-consumption, each bite is less enjoyable than the last. The first bite is the most euphoric one.
Exactly.
It's that one where you say, the chocolate cake.
Exactly. But that's very different from tolerance. It's just that our brain, that's the way it works, because it's kind of, it's just a way that our brain balances energy, and what is called salience, is that novel stimuli are more salient. Because there is a salient that is intrinsic to novelty. When something is novel, it grabs our attention. It makes perfect sense, because with something changing in our environment, it could be a threat, or it could be could be something nice. So we need to pay attention to it. But then we get used to stuff. And there is, when it comes to food, there is something like satiety. You start secreting hormones that tells you, hey, you're full, man. You don't need to eat anymore. Or too much glucose. Our stores of glucose are getting full. You don't need to eat so much sugar. Stop. Then tolerance is something different. It's that, any medicament, almost every drug that you take, it has receptors or enzymes that targets in the brain. And the body works based on homeostasis. It needs to balance things. So when there is too much of one thing, when there is too much of a stimulus, for example, if there is too much testosterone in your body, when then your testosterone receptors downregulate, because they don't need to respond so much to testosterone. If you have too much testosterone and too many testosterone receptors, your body will get out of balance and you will get sick. You will start doing things that are not adaptive. So every medication that you take develops tolerance. Almost every. Some. That's not true. I mean, there are some drugs that develop tolerance very fast, and there are some drugs that build tolerance very slowly, or even no tolerance at all. But normally there is a tolerance, because the body reacts. So it's just taking benzodiazepines. I need to take more benzodiazepines, more Valium, to get the same anxiolytic effect, because the brain adapts and downregulates the receptors. But so tolerance to compounds is different, because it affects the biochemistry of the brain. Getting used to stimuli is not the same thing, because it doesn't involve one neurotransmitter system. Our brain doesn't run on dopamine. There's many other neurotransmitters. So looking at the brain just through the dopamine glasses, that's wrong. That's eventually we're going to make mistakes if we just try to view the brain through dopamines, like if we try to view the brain through endorphins, or we try to view the brain through noradrenaline or serotonin. No, each one has its function, and those systems talk to each other. The real challenge is to see the brain as a whole, because it's so complex, and everything changes everything else. So, but going back to the main question, do we adapt to pleasure? Do we build antihedonic responses? No, it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, if you practice meditation and mindfulness, you get sensitized. You experience more. You experience things more strongly. So the way to maximize satisfaction and pleasure is to experience pleasure with mindfulness and with a certain amount of sobriety. It's like, you don't need that much of that pizza. The first 2 bites were the good ones, so why are you eating the rest? As you said before. So that's a little bit of self-knowledge and self-awareness that we need to build in our lives, which is healthy. But that's not the same thing as Puritanism, which is what Anna Lembke is preaching, which is ego-driven, because it's driven by our self-image as good people, It's not that we want to live a happy life or a life that is fulfilling, but we want to have a good image of ourselves and present that image to the others. And it's driven by our emotion of pride and shame. And that's a fundamental mistake. That's why Puritans are not happy. They're not happy people. And it's not because they abstain for pleasure. It's not even that. It's because they have too much ego.
I heard a quote once. I forget what the exact quote was, but essentially, Puritanism is the fear that someone somewhere is having fun.
Yes.
But,
yeah.
So for this hedonic desensitization of stimuli when we consume them, give, for example, the chocolate cake. As we consume the cake, we enjoy it less and less each bite. If we consume cake every day or multiple times a day, we'll start to enjoy it less. Is this, I'm going to assume this is a local phenomenon. So if I'm consuming cake, I will enjoy the cake less, but other things will remain unaffected. Is this correct?
Well, that's the same thing applies to sex, though. Because sex is a learning experience. So if you're doing sex and treating each sexual experience as a learning experience, not just about your body, but about the other person's body, and about everything in your psychology that is tied up to sex, every sexual experience becomes better. You make it better. The same way that if you ski, every time you ski better. There is a certain desensitization with skiing, though, and with a lot of sports. Is that I remember the first times I went to the snow, the whole experience of the mountain and the snow was so overwhelmingly beautiful that it just stayed in my mind, in my memory forever. And now I go skiing and, it's nice, the snow is so beautiful. But it's not the same because, I get used to it. We get used to all the good stuff. That's unavoidable.
There's nothing like the first time.
Well, yeah, there is one way to bring it back. It's take cannabis. and then a lot, it's like you listen to this song. It's like, I never listened to this song before. You have this novelty experience. Cannabis, that's why people like cannabis. And I take a little bit of cannabis, just a microdose, when I go skiing, because it brings back that state of when I was a teenager and went to the mountains for the first time. You feel this little clump of snow rolling down the face, and it's like, oh, that's so beautiful.
It seems almost like a sort of pseudo-mindfulness. You're just so aware of things.
Yeah, that's what mindfulness brings. So I went into Zen retreats. They are called sessions. And it's like the hardest thing I've done in my life because they involve a lot of discipline and they're actually painful. Zen meditation is painful for me because I cannot sit cross-legged comfortably for a long period of time. But I remember after we finished a 2-week session in the summer, and I was going to drive the people in the sessions back in my car. So I sat in my car, turned on the ignition, and the stereo, I have left it on, so automatically turned on and started playing Dire Straits. And everybody in the car went, wow. Because we have been practicing meditation for that week, and we were in this hypersensitive state And all of a sudden, the music just completely washed over us and overwhelmed us. It was so beautiful. And the funny thing is that everybody experienced the same thing. Because the other thing that happens in Zen retreats that is quite amazing is that you become so empathetic that you are completely attuned to the emotions of everybody around you. So what happens after the first few days on a week-long session is that everybody cycles at the same time. And you have periods of euphoria, and you have periods, and you have downs. And everybody's doing the same thing. And you feel that you're crashing, and everybody around you is crashing. But when you realize that there is that empathy in itself is so beautiful that makes it up for the crashing. And the director, the monk that is directing the session, realizes that and brings us out of the crashing. Starts talking to us, and boom, all of a sudden you're back. And when you're euphoric, it brings you down. It's like, no, you need to find balance.
Finding balance. I suppose the crux of it all at the end of the day. One of my problems with, well, I find this problem with a lot of things, including Dopamine Nation, is that there's a lot of value judgment placed upon things. But the reason I'm interested in the brain, specifically reward systems in the first place, is just to understand hedonic strategy. Because at the end of the day, for some reason, I happen to wake up one day having been born, and I'll have this window of experience until I'm dead at the end of it. And within this window of experience, for whatever reason, I have this brain that for which I have no user manual whatsoever. I just have it, and I've been trying to figure out how to use it. And I think that, in my opinion, well, this is what I'd like to do with this podcast in part. This is not the sole focus, but this is one of the focuses. I'd like to understand just a hedonic strategy, really just understanding descriptively what the brain does. So based on, well, what we've talked about thus far, and also what research you've done, how do we create a functional hedonic strategy? So avoiding the pitfalls, such as compulsions and that kind of thing, but also maximizing the amount of hedonic reward we can get sustainably, so that we can have our brains respond more favorably to our experience. What insights do you think you have to share on that subject?
That is the question. That is a very good question. So first thing I want to say is that, yeah, we need to balance things, but we can balance our lives on the side of pleasure. We can balance our lives on the side of happiness. We don't need to balance our life on the side of pain or in the side of some boring equilibrium between pain and pleasure. No, we can make our life interesting and pleasurable and happy, and we don't need to pay a price for every time we feel happy. That's not true. There is no price to pay. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can be happy. What you need to be happy is to be smart and to work hard and to be self-disciplined. But being self-disciplined meaning loving yourself, loving your life. Going deeper, what it means, what we want is to live a meaningful life. What we want is to live a good life, which doesn't mean having a lot of pleasure, but doesn't mean of having a lot of pain or having to renounce pleasure. It means to realize what it really matters in your life, what is really important for you, and then going after that. And for everybody, that's going to be different. For some people, they may just want to be alive with a lot of pleasure. For some people, it will mean a lot of, devoting yourself to others or to political causes. For everybody, it's different. And it's an ongoing quest. Every day we should ask ourselves, what is meaningful for us? What is meaningful for me today? What shall I do today? This is a unique day in my life. What shall I do with it? And for me, the sentence that expresses that balance is follow a path with a heart. Something that is not just rational. It's not just thinking about it. It has to be rational and it has to be emotional too. Is what is meaningful for me? What is meaningful for me in my life? What really fulfills me? Is interacting with people? Is giving to people? Is experiencing pleasure? Is getting knowledge? Is knowing stuff? It's seeing myself as part of a meaningful universe. What is meaningful? What makes my life complete, deeply? What fulfills me intellectually, emotionally, and physically? And then just, follow that path with the heart.
It seems what you're saying is pursue what is meaningful.
Yeah. I think meaning is the key to a good life. Because we are complex entities, we human beings. We are not just physical, but we are not just disembodied spirits. We need to find something that satisfies our intellect, our emotions, and our body at the same time. And, we talk about pleasure, we always think about sex and food when we talk about pleasure, but, what about listening to music? What about reading good books? What about the pleasure, the profound satisfaction when all of a sudden the bulb goes on in your head and you understand something, when you understand stuff? That's pleasure. That's great.
If I didn't know better, I'd call that light bulb moment addictive.
Yeah, it's not addictive. It's that, man, we like the good stuff, and that's not addiction. It's natural to like pleasure. It's natural to like things that makes us feel good, that fulfills our life. If we become Puritans, if we sacrifice our life, if we give away, good food and good sex and masturbation and porn and all that, well, in the name of what are we doing that? In the name to achieve what? That's what we need to ask ourselves. I'm giving up this, and what do I get? Am I going to get something, or is it's just ego? It's just because I get this pat in my back and I think that I'm better than anybody else. Because that's what ego is. So, going back to the quote that you said before, it's Puritanism is to feel, but that somebody is having pleasure, somewhere, because you're not having fun. Because in the end, that's envy. What you're experiencing is envy. It's not that you are going to be pure and caste yourself. It's that everybody around you has to be the same, because otherwise you're being foolish.
I think one thing that you said a few sentences ago is absolutely key. You said, you're doing this, you're foregoing this pleasure, but you're doing this for what? And I think that's a key thing when it comes to a hedonic strategy. I understand that people, of course, have their values outside of hedonism generally, but as far as a hedonic strategy goes, you have to ask yourself, what is this doing to the general enjoyment of my life? And that is what I want to direct my final question to. I will assume that the listener, for the most part, if somebody has sat through this much, I'm going to assume that they don't want to be Puritans, that people want to experience pleasure. So how can you experience pleasure and lots of it, but without succumbing to the dark sides of pleasure, such as compulsive behavior? How do you go about executing a hedonic strategy such that you get lots of pleasure, but you avoid the compulsion, you avoid the desensitization, rather? How do you do that?
With mindfulness. You have to be mindful about the pleasure. And, sometimes we're eating or we're having sex or something or listening to music. I don't want to be too fixated on sex. And we're not really with it. We're thinking about something else. And we're not on the moment. So we're wasting the pleasure. We went to an expensive restaurant, we're having this great food, and we're thinking about work. We're not just eating mechanically and not tasting the food. You're wasting your money. So yeah, be there. Eat mindfully. Going back to my Zen practice, when I was in sessions, having lunch, having all the meals was part of meditation. You have to sit in the meditation room, in the dojo, and follow a very specific ritual to eat your meal, which including cleaning your bowls after the meal, so nobody has to do dishes. And what I experienced there is that the food, which was normally quite bland, it tasted so good because you were in this hypersensitive state, and also you were cultivating mindfulness. The whole ritual was to enhance the mindfulness about eating. So when you put the food in your mouth, it's like, oh my God, that's texture and the taste and the act of swallowing it. Everything is great. So yeah, mindfulness. That's how you maximize enjoying of your life.
I want to end it. Well, first of all, I had a similar experience, but not resulting from mindfulness. I was quite a bit younger. I didn't even know what mindfulness was. But I recall I was on a camping trip with my family, and I was very hungry. We were all very hungry because we were quote unquote roughing it, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I remember I was given a potato, a boiled potato, no salt, no seasoning. But when I ate that potato, since I was so hungry, my entire attention fixated on it, and that was the best unseasoned potato I've ever had in my life.
Yeah.
I want to end this with reference to one study by Gilbert and Killingsworth titled "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." This study was done via ESM data. Essentially what they do is they ping the participants randomly throughout their day and ask them, what are you doing right now? How are you feeling right now? What are you thinking about right now? And they found that even when people were having positive thoughts, not to mention negative thoughts or neutral thoughts, if at all their mind was wandering from what they were doing in the moment, they reported being unhappier. And that's why the title of the paper was "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind."
Well, I have a caveat of that. Is that because we exaggerate about that too. And I recently became aware that the state of daydreaming, which is the default mode network in the brain, it has to be engaged sometimes if you want to live a balanced life. It's true that we live overstimulated. There is so much stuff in our lives that we don't stop. If it's not the TV, is social media or something else, listening to music or working hard. We're always on something. In the old times, during most of human history, we have a lot of spare time to daydream, to remember. We take tons of pictures these days with our phones, but when do we look at those pictures? We don't have time to look at the pictures. But the most important thing is that we don't have time to reminisce. We don't have time to remember our past life, our memories. So memories, when you don't experience them, they disappear. So we lose our past. We lose touch with who we were in the past because we don't have enough silent time where we let our mind wander and, touch on that memory of 15 years ago or, imagine what we're going to do next year or daydream about something that's never going to happen, but it's okay to fantasize about. And those states are also good. We need to experience. There is no real creative state. We cannot create. We cannot write a novel if we don't have that wandering mind. That's the space where new things happen. So that's another way of being Puritan, is like being so disciplined that we're always doing something. And we do that to our children. It's like, after class, you go to gymnastics, and then it's going to be reading time, and then it's going to be dinner. There is no empty time. And we are creating a very unhealthy generation, very, very anxious with a lot of psychological problems. So something is wrong.
Okay.
And drawing on the anxious generation by Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if you heard of that book.
I have.
But he blames social media and lack of thrilling experience. But I also think it's lack of just empty time, But let the child get bored. Boring can be good.
Balance in the age of indulgence.
Yeah.
Dr. Hermes Solenzol, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Nicolas.
Where can people find you?
They can find me my website, Sex, Science, and Spirit, which is a weird combination of things. That gives me an excuse to write about anything that I like. It's hermesolenzol.com. It's in English and Spanish. I don't promise that all the articles in Spanish are going to be translated to English and vice versa, but I make an effort. The important ones are bilingual. They can find me in Medium, Hermes Solenzol. They can find me increasingly in Substack, and also trying to start my own podcast that might be called Sex and Synapses, which I'm going to do with a new friend called Sarah. So it's going to be, I have male and female voices, which I think is a good balance, again. And we hope to get it started this year. But otherwise, and read my novels. I have 6 novels in Spanish. The first one is published in English. It's called Games of Love and Kink. And I'm about to release the second one, which is going to call Cecilia Unleashed. They are historical novels that happens in the time of my youth, when Spain was transitioning from dictatorship to democracy in the late 70s. And it was a very beautiful time where the country was going through a tremendous social transformation. And I reflect that social transformation in my characters as they go about discovering love and sex and kink. So it's a mixture of romance, a little bit of erotica, and a lot of historic novels.
Excellent. And this will, of course, all be linked in the description. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you so much. Bye.
If you like this episode, I think you'll like one of these 2 episodes here. Also, please subscribe if you enjoyed the podcast, as it is the single best way for me to get more and better guests on the show.